Thank you for joining us for another video with the Anselm Institute. We're doing a series on virtue. Had our first two videos on the relationship or the link between virtue and happiness, the delinking of virtue and happiness. And now we're going back to ask more fundamental questions about what a virtue is, understanding the nature of what a virtue is. And we've touched some on that in previous videos, but we're going to focus this video on going a little bit deeper in that, talking I think it'll be primarily about the cardinal virtues, but also some about the theological virtues. So, anything else you'd add, Ryan, and feel free to um, to set us up for that if there's anything else you'd add.
Yeah, that's a good segue. I think the for the listener or the watcher, just to recall the other two videos. The first is we talked about um, the morality of obligation versus the morality of happiness, and in the second video we talked about how that disjunct occurred and how the morality of obligation focuses almost exclusively on one's obligations as commanded by God, and very little, if any at all, on happiness, human flourishing, and one's final end, which is the beatific vision and the fulfillment of all of our intellectual and moral and desires of our will, beauty and goodness and truth. And so, what we want to do today is carry forward that conversation from the perspective of virtue, which is the center point around which the morality of happiness is developed. Morality of obligation, the center point was commandments. And we saw that commandments are important, they're essential, but they're not the central point around which one should organize one's thinking about their life. And certainly it's not the way that Augustine organized his thinking or Aquinas. And so today we want to look further into what a virtue is, because a virtue is, according to Thomas Aquinas, absolutely essential to the human flourishing in this life and in the next. So that's what we want to talk about today.
Great. And as you and I were talking a little bit before, you'd mentioned and you'd mentioned this in a previous video, that a virtue is a habit. Could we maybe start a little bit talking through habits and how those relate to virtues?
Yeah, perfect. So a virtue is a habit, but maybe not in the way you think. As we use the word habit in our contemporary culture, it's a withered, kind of shriveled version of that term as it's used in the tradition. As we use the term habit today, what we mean is some kind of semi-conscious, mechanical, thoughtless, repeated behavior. Like you might say someone has a habit of biting their nails, or someone has a habit of interrupting, or something like that. That's not what we mean by habit in this context. Instead, what we mean by habit is a much more rich and robust understanding. A habit is the English way to translate the Latin word habitus. And what a habit is in that more technical sense of the meaning, and the way we're using it here, a virtue is a good habit. That's all it is. A virtue is a habit that leads to your flourishing in this life and the next. So what is a habit? In order to get a grasp on what virtue is, one has to understand first what a habit is. And if a habit is not this semi-unconscious, repetitive, mechanistic behavior, that's not what we're meaning by that term. What do we mean? We mean a settled disposition, a settled inclination, something that is a major part of you that's hard to change. And that's that shriveled version of habit is part of what that means. It's hard to change. I have this habit of biting my nails, and we use the idea of habit as something that I do without thinking, and it's hard to change. And in that sense, that's a correct use of the term habit. And what we need to add to that is the idea that a habit is part of what makes you who you are. It's not just a behavior you don't like. It's part of what makes you who you are. A habit it stands in between, as a midpoint between your personality, your talents, your giftings on the one hand, and your actions on the other. A habit occupies a middle place. And we could go further and say a habit is part of what you do reflexively. It's that inclination that is deeply ingrained within you that sometimes you will act out of, and before you realize it, you have acted in a way that maybe you regret, or God willing, you act in a way that you're happy with and is appropriate and fitting, but you acted in that way out of this reflex because of this habit, this settled inclination that is part of who you are. And since a habit is something that's settled and difficult to change, it's part of the key of who you are and of how you live your life today. You can see this, for example, if someone shows up late and you say, "Man, so and so is late. That's not like him." Well, there's a difference. You're describing there in just common sense, everyday language, the difference between their action and what the person is like. They're late, that's the action, and you say, "That's not like them." Or maybe it's the other way around. The person shows up on time and you say, "That's not like you."
Mm.
You're usually late. But what happens if, over the course of a year, you meet every week and the person's on time every time? You're going to stop saying, "That's not like you." You might say that, every week for a couple of weeks, but after a while, their being on time starts to become part of who they are, such that it's no longer true, and we wouldn't say, "It's not like you." So this is what a habit is. It's a settled inclination, settled disposition to act in a particular way. Whether you act in a particular way that leads to your flourishing or not depends on whether the habit is a virtue that leads to your flourishing or a vice. And so that's the idea of a habit. And
Super helpful.
we can go one step further. And Micah, you probably want to jump in on this piece. So if a
Could
habit
I
is something that's a, go ahead.
could I jump in with three quick things? Just what you
Yeah.
said there. That it was helpful. I'm thinking of, I believe it was Aristotle who said a habit is what we repeatedly do,
Yeah.
or we are what we repeatedly do, rather. And that touches upon a habit being a part of your being. They're difficult to change, and we all know what that's like. So things that are they're either difficult to change, and that's good because you're used to doing the right thing, or they're difficult to change, and that's bad because you're used to doing the wrong thing. And often another comment, especially with the example of biting your nails, we don't because we've lost this morality of virtue, don't tend to associate habits with uh, we tend to think of habits as basically morally indifferent, rather than good or bad. I don't think of biting my nails as like, you don't think of that as a moral evil, and that's the way we use habits.
Mm-hmm.
Even though you could make an argument that is you can make an argument to that effect, not something that it's a grave matter. But anyways, those are just a few thoughts. But you were going to segue it, make a significant transition, and I interrupted.
Yeah. And before I do that, I want to make one additional point based off what you just said. Part of the idea of a virtue or a habit is the habit, in addition to it expressing part of who you are, it solidifies further who you are.
Right,
Um, and that's that idea of that there's kind of a momentum that habits
right,
have, and also reinforce,
right,
which is why it's hard to break habits and make new ones.
right.
And so
And
there's a
also why it's possible that you can, even though there's the inertia moving you forward with a bad habit, with the great effort of the will, you can turn it around.
Yeah, right, and there's a great effort of the will. There's a scholastic maxim, which is that all habits are voluntary, and what they mean by that is we seldom like choose a habit. What we do is we engage our will. We make choices for certain actions, and then those actions develop the habit or reinforce the habit or the virtue or the vice. So all virtues or vices, by their nature, are voluntary. We may find it very difficult to overcome a virtue. I mean, overcome a vice if it's been ingrained, but the if it's been ingrained part is because it's been ingrained because of our choices.
Right.
So it's an important component, and you can see how this would develop into a complete moral theology that begins with the idea of habits. Well, it begins with the idea of your final end, and then the idea of how you get there, which is human actions. That's will, intellect. We talk about that. And then what happens when you're engaging your will and intellect on a regular basis, which is a habit, which can be a virtue or a vice. So so that's the idea. The next step here is a habit, when understood as a virtue or a vice, it perfects or deforms a particular power that you have. And powers, and so in the scholastic understanding, you have faculties, powers, and acts. And what a habit does is it perfects the power to act in a particular way. It doesn't perfect the faculty so much as it perfects the operation of that faculty. So the scholastic definitions will talk about a habit being an operative perfection or operative potency or potential ability. So that means that that's the reason why you may have heard there's the 4 cardinal virtues and the 3 theological virtues, right? The 4 cardinal virtues are prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. And the reason why they're cardinal, the idea is St. Thomas teaches that every single moral and intellectual virtue can be grouped under one of those 4 cardinal virtues: prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance. Why is that? Because those are like the sources, the fountainhead for all the different virtues. Why is that? Because each of those virtues perfects a particular operation of one of our main faculties. And I'll just kind of mention these faculties. I'll link them up. And then, Michael, you may want to jump in on this one. So we have prudence, which is a virtue that perfects what's called the practical intellect. You can distinguish your intellect into speculative, which is like just seeking truth for its own sake, and practical, which is seeking truth for action. And so prudence is the virtue that perfects your practical reasoning. In other words, just how wise your decisions are about how to act. Justice is the virtue that perfects the will, the operation of the will, to give everyone what they're owed. And so, in other words, what it does is it helps you come to. I'm going to try and use the scholastic language insofar as it's helpful, but also try to use more concrete language that makes more sense to the average person today. When we talk about prudence or justice, fortitude, temperance, perfecting a particular operation of a faculty, what we mean is helping you love what God loves. That's what we mean. Because each of these, Thomas teaches that every one of these virtues at their core is charity. They're coming to know and love what God knows and loves. And because that looks different for the practical intellect versus the will, versus the parts of your emotions that desire, the parts of your emotions that attack or fight, it looks different for each one of those. Therefore, they have different names. But behind all of that is the idea of loving what God loves, coming to reflexively do that. And so justice is the next one, where we come to give what is owed to each person and to love it and to desire it, which is why that's seated in the will. The next one, the next 2, justice, fortitude, temperance, have to do with the 2 different types of emotions. We talked about emotions last week, or last video. And Thomas teaches that you've got 2 groups of emotions or passions. And one group, or what he calls the concupiscible or the desiring passions, emotions, and the other one is the irascible or the fighting passions. And the way you distinguish between the 2, concupiscible passions have to do with a desire or good that you possess or want to possess, want to have. And the irascible passions have to do with obstacles to possessing or obstacles to retaining. And they're the fighting passions. And so because of that, you have these 2 further cardinal virtues: fortitude, which has to do with the fighting passions. Some contemporary moral theologians just use the word courage to name fortitude. And it's the idea of persisting in a just, reasonable struggle to obtain something either externally or even internally. So, for example, sometimes we need to exercise fortitude in prayer. Many of us have had the occasion where it's come to the appointed time for prayer, and we find ourselves resisting it and not wanting to do it, which is a type of unruly, irascible passion. And so the passions have to be trained. And Bonaventure didn't believe the passions were things that could be subjects of virtue. Thomas takes a different view on that. And so fortitude is the virtue associated with the fighting passions. And then the final one, temperance, is the virtue associated with the desiring, the concupiscible passions, the things where we delight in what we have, and we seek to get those things that we take to be good. And you can even see how this term temperance, it took over basically, there's a type of temperance having to do with its opposite. The opposite of temperance is you can have an excess and a defect, but the excess is gluttony, which is one of the 7 main vices, which has to do with an excessive desire for the pleasure of food and drink. Not an excessive eating, not an excessive drink, an excessive desire for the pleasures of food and drink. And temperance helps one to behave in ways that are not just reasonable, but also lead to human flourishing and help you come to love what God loves. So you have those 4 cardinal virtues, which each link up with one of those 4 main parts or faculties of our how God has made us. Michael, you want to jump in on the faculties piece there?
No, that's really well said. I don't have too much more to add. I thought that was really well summarized, but I'll mention a few things. So Ryan talked about our 2 primary spiritual faculties, the intellect and the will, and the intellect is ordered toward truth. So when we're seeking to know something, we're seeking to know the truth about it. Ryan mentioned distinguishing between contemplation, which is when you're meditating upon something that is a truth that is not for the purpose of some act, but simply for the sake of knowing truth itself. And Ryan might have more to say about that. But then prudence, which pertains to the moral virtues or the cardinal virtues, and that has to do with the truth to be done or some act to be done. But what you're doing with prudence is you're taking principles, and this is the reason that contemplation and reflection is important, is because you're drawing from those principles and bringing them into a particular act and saying, what is the good that must be done here? And so then you can see how once that's determined, prudence was regarded as a governing virtue among the moral virtues, because you're first having to ask, what is the good to be done here? You're drawing from moral principles, and the most fundamental which is do good and avoid evil. And you're drawing from that to be able to recognize what do I need to do? What is prudent here? And then justice, as Ryan said, is the will giving to each what is due. And that was a classical understanding of justice held by Cicero, Plato, Aristotle, to give to each what is due. And Plato and Aristotle, and St. Augustine and St. Thomas after them, also understood that giving what is due involves this right ordering of the faculties that we've talked about before, where you don't allow unreasonable or unruly passions to steer the ship in what you do, but instead you begin with asking, okay, what's the right thing to do? And then you sincerely seek an answer to that. And then once that's determined through justice, you give what is due. I think there's a lot that we could say, in another setting or another context about about what is due, and metaphysical questions about the gradation of being that are important, and how what is due to God, this is a matter of religion, is to love him above all things. Ryan was talking about love, and there's a phrase used by St. Augustine, and I think it's picked up by St. Thomas. But the idea of ordering your loves, we should love God above all things. He is the highest good, the source of all goods, and then to love our neighbor as ourself. And we love lower goods lesser than higher goods, and higher goods above lower goods, and the highest good above all things. So the intellect seeks the truth. The will, it's ordered toward an end. And this is where teleology comes in, or um, final causality, the idea that each purpose, the parts of our soul are for some end. So the intellect is meant to seek the true. The will is meant to seek the good. And we could say more about this, but Ryan touched on in one of our other videos about the unity of the transcendentals, and that's relevant here. It's the good is being as related to the will, and um, truth is being as resides in the intellect, or pertains to the intellect, you could say. So there's the intellect, the will, and then Ryan touched on the. I'm basically repeating your really helpful summary. The irascible appetite and the concupiscible appetite. Concupiscence is a term that we very foreign to us. But you can think of it simply as um, desire that has the possibility of being disordered, or it may have been understood by the scholastics. Ryan, you'll probably know this as inherently, that term used as inherently disordered, or did it just mean desire itself?
The latter.
The latter, just desire itself. Okay. So the concupiscible, that's right. That would make sense, because
Yeah.
it's not our emotions, as Ryan has said, they're not inherently bad. They just have to
Right.
be subject to reason. And so
Right.
you desire things, you see food or you see some good and you desire it, but it has to be subject to reason. And temperance is what is the virtue through which you moderate. And it was particularly two things: your appetites pertaining to food, or this was most discussed. There may be other things that it could apply to, but also your sexual appetites, both of those things. And then with fortitude, as Ryan said, referred to as more commonly as courage, when you see some good that you must do, or some evil that you must resist, and there's some difficulty that keeps you from pursuing the good or from resisting the evil, it's courage that gives you the strength to be able to do that. And so those are the virtues, the cardinal virtues: prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude.
Right. Yeah. And those virtues, you can see how, you just imagine, take that example that Michael just gave about some particular good that you have to, or some evil that you have to resist to retain a good. That's the irascible passions or emotions. But in terms of how you actually resist that, it's going to require prudence. And in terms of the people you interact with while you're resisting, it's going to require justice, that you treat people fairly, and with charity. And behind each of the virtues themselves is love. And so it's important to break these down, these four cardinal virtues, to see what faculty they're related to and what operations they perfect. But it's also important to, after you do the breakdown, so you can understand them, to resynthesize them, to see how in most of your actions you're going to be employing all of them at once. Which is why when you're weak in one, but strong in another, we've all had this experience where we see ourselves doing well in some area but poorly in another, and we go, "Gosh, how come I can do well over here but poorly over here?" And it has to do with the way that the virtues interrelate with respect to a particular issue, which is a subject of a different conversation. But it's important. What I'm trying to say here is, when we analyze them, break them down, identify the faculties they relate to. A faculty is just an ability to do things. It's an inbuilt capacity based on who we are, how God has made us. And so, since the idea here is that we're being perfected by God's grace and by our own natural actions, therefore, that each one of those faculties, when they're perfected, they have a different, the operation of those faculties perfected, they have a different name. One other thing to mention here, which we'll probably talk about this in more detail in future conversations, is that you can have acquired cardinal virtues, which is, and infused cardinal virtues. You can have acquired cardinal virtues. That's virtues that you develop on the natural level of things by repeated actions. you can also, each one of the cardinal virtues can also be infused in a supernatural sense, and not just by God, infused not just as the efficient cause, the one who does the infusing, but also in kind. There's a particular, when you have an infused cardinal virtue of prudence, it's of not just you're not just sort of speaking about the way in which you came to have that virtue, it's also a different type. It's in the same category basically, or we wouldn't use the term
Ryan, we
prudence.
were talking about this earlier, and the reason that I knew that there was a discussion about this and some attention given to it, it's a really important topic, but in a deep level of Thomistic moral theology, is I read I read parts of a dissertation that was on this topic, and I think it was someone out of Freiburg, but it's public. It was public. I'll see if I can recover it. But yeah, that's an important distinction. One of the things that I thought would be helpful for people is if we just give an example of how this might work. I'm going to just provide a simple one, and if you want to add to it, work with it, or bring in another one, feel free. But for all of us, we know what it's like to be pressured to do something that we don't feel comfortable with, or something that we don't think is right. And that pressure, particularly in the society that we're in, there are different ways to leverage that pressure and make it difficult for you to do the right thing. But the first thing that you would want to do in that situation is try to buy yourself some time to really think, okay, what is the right thing to do here? And then once you determine that, then it's a matter of justice to do it. And when you have, it's an example of courage when you say, I know this is the right thing, I've got to do it, this is what I owe in this situation. It may regard speaking the truth about something, or some other act, some other thing. And in that situation, it's difficult to do. You're facing opposition, but it's the virtue of courage. You've exercised prudence, determining the right thing, and then through justice, you give the right thing, and through fortitude, you give it even when it's hard, or even when it's going to cost you in some way. That's kind of still more general, but it brings it more concrete to people, in work situations or whatever situation they might face. Any thoughts on that?
No, I think that's exactly right, and I think it's good to use that as an illustration of what the virtues are, the cardinal virtues, how they interrelate. And one thing I would add to that is that part of the idea of a virtue, there's this what historically has been called the ladder of virtue, and you can think about it like a pyramid where it has 4 segments, and the bottom segment is where you do the wrong thing but you don't know it, and that historically is called ignorance. And the next level up, and I'm sure everyone listening to this, if you look inside your own heart and your own experience, you've seen this development in your own life. The first level is you do the wrong thing willingly, delightfully, and you don't know it. That's ignorance. The next one up is what's historically been called incontinence, where you do the wrong thing and you know it, but you feel like you can't help yourself. You can't stop. That's incontinence. The next level up is called continence, which is where you know what the right thing to do is, and you do it, but only with great difficulty. And the next level up is considered to be the apex of virtue. Each one you're approximating, you're moving towards. So it's not like an on or off switch. It's more of a spectrum. You're moving toward virtue each time. But the final level is considered to be the core of what virtue is, which is where you know the right thing to do and you do it effortlessly with joy. You could say it in another way. You know what to do. You do it reflexively, without hesitation, and you delight in doing it, even if sometimes it may bring difficulties or challenges or whatever. That's the apex of virtue. And it goes to what I was saying earlier in a previous video. When we're being conformed into Christ, when we're being made more and more like Jesus, what we're wanting to do is have our thoughts, our actions, and our emotions made more and more to reflexively do what Jesus's thoughts, emotions, and actions would do. And so you can see that development and that sort of pyramid or ladder of virtue. Um, and maybe one other point I'd like to make here about these difference between what are called acquired moral virtues and infused moral virtues. And we can talk about this more at another time, but I just make this as a placeholder to avoid confusion. When the scholastics and the tradition speaks about acquired versus infused, there's a difference between someone who's a believer, a Christian, and not a Christian when it comes to acquired moral virtues. But just so people don't think that what it means for what an acquired moral virtue is something that's entirely about me and not about God at all. That's a non-Christian perspective on the world itself. And so there's a whole different subject, which perhaps we can talk about another time, called primary causality and secondary causality, or first cause, second cause. And basically the fact that my computer is working, the fact that I'm breathing, the fact that Michael is doing what he's doing, it's all because God's holding us in existence. He hasn't just created us, he's also conserving us in existence. And also he is concurring with our actions. He's giving us the power to do the things that we do. And so when we speak about acquired moral virtue, God is the primary cause of even an acquired moral virtue insofar as it has being and existence. And we are the secondary cause of those things. But when we speak about infused moral virtue, there is no sense in which we are the secondary cause of those things. It's purely supernatural. God is the prime cause and the only cause, because we don't have the ability to cause something supernatural. And that's what an infused virtue is. So I mentioned this to hold off, to stave off a potential misunderstanding that for acquired moral virtues, we're on our own. And sometimes God stands off at a distance and gives us a thumbs up. And then there's infused moral virtues. It's not like that. They're both totally dependent on God, but in different ways.
Yeah, super helpful. I was going to loop back also briefly to the latter. I thought that was extremely helpful and beautiful about the moving up the ladder of virtue. And one of the things that I think will be practically helpful for people watching is when you're in the initial stages where you move from ignorance to incontinence, it's very difficult, and your initial efforts to strive at virtue will seem to you fumbling at times, but the striving is extremely important.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and like, for example, you could say you realize, oh, this is wrong, and I've been doing it this way, for the past 15 years with all of my closest friends, and then I realize it's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Well, your first efforts at not doing whatever that is, especially around people that have been your closest friends for 15 years, it's going to be very awkward trying to explain. And a lot of it is you may not even feel like you have the resources to explain it well. And so, but it's very important that we all push in that direction. And our initial efforts may not be as smooth as someone that is whatever has moved further up the ladders, and they've made more progress in virtue, and it's just reflexive and habitual for them. But I think in this example, I think primarily of myself. I think of instances, let's say 10 or 15 years ago, where something that's easier now was very difficult then. And when I did it, I overdid it. There's something that's difficult and it requires courage, and you got to work yourself up to do it. And then you plow through it, and it's a little bit over the top. But those are efforts at virtue, and the next time you can be more measured, and your response will be less over the top, but also in the right direction. That's my best description of that. But it's really just an exhortation for all of us to continue to try to make progress in virtue, especially when things seem initially difficult.
That's right. That's right. And part of the idea is, one, we can never really say we fully arrived in this
Right.
life. But we need to be honest with ourselves about the degree to which we are moving up that sort of pyramid of virtue or not. Because even though habits are settled dispositions, they can be changed.
Right.
They can be changed in the sense that they can be improved, or in the sense that they can be degraded, that they can lead to, they can turn into a vice. And so this is part of the reason why there's this moral exhortation. When you find, there's several years ago, I was in an elevator at work, and I was going up and had a Starbucks coffee, and the guy said, "Oh, Starbucks." I call that $5. It's like $5. You try to go in and out of there every time. Now it's like $10. And I said, yeah, this is my guilty pleasure. And he goes, well, one leads to another. Okay, bye. And and I thought, oh, I just got like a little moral exhortation from this guy in the elevator. And he's right. Because the harboring of one, the giving shelter to a guilty pleasure, a pleasure you know to be disordered, leads to others because you're weakening the other virtues.
Yeah.
And so this is part of the core of, we can say as Christians, there go I, but for the grace of God.
Right.
And that's why I made that point about the acquired moral virtues. It's not like it's all me and not God at all. It's all God and it's all me in the acquired moral virtues. In the infused moral virtues, it's all God and it's not me. It's very similar to initial justification. So it's important once we realize we do have a settled disposition. We are harboring something that is not going to lead to our flourishing. You have to be careful of that, flag that, mark that, tell someone you love and whose opinion you trust. I noticed this about myself today. Help me to notice when I'm doing this, because that is part of the core where this stuff about, which can seem a little abstract philosophically and theologically, it gets very real, very concrete in terms of leading to this happiness, morality of happiness. And what we're talking about is almost entirely absent from the morality of obligation. Because in the morality of obligation, it's just your actions. We have this excessive focus on your actions and casuistry and whether the particular action is sinful or not sinful. It's obviously important to speak about whether actions are sinful or not sinful, but there is an antecedent question that is behind the action itself, which is your inclination, the things that you love, the things that you're drawn to. And that's where virtue, that's the place, the position that virtue occupies. And how you can identify when you have, this is maybe my final kind of exhortation on this, it's important to pay attention to your emotions, not to be drug around by them, but to pay attention to them, because you will often see the way your emotions can get out ahead of you on something. And it's a great indicator. It's like a spiritual beacon that tells you what you really love, what you really desire, what you really think is valuable, what you really think is worthwhile, what you really think is worth pursuing. And you can ask yourself, is that right?
Right.
And if it isn't, then you know that you have more training to do with respect to that concupiscible appetite, the desiring appetite or the fighting appetite or whatever, in that particular area. So it gives great information about where you are internally, because we can often be confused about where we are.
Right. Yeah, that's really well said. I just had one other point going back to your elevator. I think in our society, our visceral response to that sort of thing is just leave me alone. Leave me alone about my coffee. But this goes back to we don't think about something that we had talked about before, that we don't think about our actions, morality as applying to each and every human act, but it does. How we spend our time, that's a moral decision. You can think, okay, I'd mentioned before, there's not a moral difference between chocolate or vanilla or strawberry ice cream. Yeah, that's right. But there is a moral difference about whether or not we eat ice cream, or how much we eat, or the setting in which we eat it, or the time we eat it. All of those there are moral consequences to those questions. Is it fitting for me to have port when I have diabetes and my spouse is about to serve an appropriate dinner in 10 minutes? Those are moral decisions. So it's been 40 minutes on the cardinal virtues, and this seems like, if it's okay with you, a good spot to stop. And then maybe in future videos we could talk through the theological virtues, and then you had mentioned the daughters of the cardinal virtues. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, I think in the future we'll talk about the theological virtues, what are called the daughters of the cardinal virtues, and then also have the same kind of treatment of vices, the seven capital vices, and then they have 44 daughters, and how that stuff matters for your personal life and your assessment of kind of where you are and where you've been and where you're headed.
Great. We'll look forward to interacting with anyone in the comments, and then look forward to our next video. Thank you all.
Thanks, Michael.